If you listen to Donald Trump, the illegal war on Iran is a tremendous success. Others have taken a rather different view based on, I guess, minor details like the evidence. I'm really delighted today to be talking to Sina Toossi, who is a fellow at the Centre for International Policy, Iranian American analyst. We've spoke before a few weeks, well, in fact, a couple of times now, and every time I do, people are very, very, very appreciative of your analysis. So it's a real honor at a very difficult time to be able to speak to you. So thanks for joining us again.
Of course, thank you for having me again.
I'd just start. I mean, take Pete Hegseth, the cartoonish Secretary of War, as we're now supposed to call him, saying, "Look, we've stopped all these. We've destroyed their ability to fire missiles, and the number of missiles they're firing is falling. We're going to have total air superiority. We can rain death and destruction all day long." Not paraphrasing there, unfortunately. What's your response to that kind of triumphalism which is being presented by the Trump administration at the moment?
Yeah, it's against the reality of the situation, arguably, and how bad this has turned out for the administration, and how contrary, I would argue, to what their expectations really were in getting into this, which I would situation that I would describe as a quagmire, a huge quagmire for the U.S. I think Trump's expectation was this could be a quick military campaign following his kidnapping of Maduro, following his kind of one off strikes against Iran's military facilities last summer in the June war that Israel launched on Iran. But this time we've seen that, Iran has retaliated immediately. It's gone very high on the escalation ladder immediately and is striking U.S. bases and interests in the Persian Gulf region and throughout the entire region, alongside targeting Israel. And it's closed the Strait of Hormuz, which upwards of 40% of global energy hydrocarbon exports come out of. Critical choke point that is having ramifications on the global economy, stock market, and that's only going to accumulate over time. Now, a key part of this war and Iran's capabilities and means of defending itself is its ballistic missile capability and its drone capability, both of which were arguably proven to be effective and sophisticated in, hitting targets in Israel, circumventing these kind of multi-layer Israeli and American air defense systems. And in that equation, Iran is firing these relatively cheap drones and missiles, and they have to be intercepted with multiple, much more expensive interceptors, of which America and Israel have very limited quantities. They already burned through upwards of a third of some of the most strategic interceptors, like the THAAD missile interceptors. And now, they're depleting through those rapidly. So to this point where, Hegseth is talking about, we're hitting them hard, we're raining death and destruction, these kind of, frankly, languages of war crimes and language of atrocities that, once were made by like Nazi officials, and now we're seeing it from this guy who might be a Nazi. I don't know. And
His tattoos suggest he might be. So
yeah, absolutely, his tattoos do. And so Iran, they have said that their military plans are for such a conflict to be many months at least. And so they obviously do have a limited stockpile of missiles. And I think a more limited factor on them is the launchers. And so, the launchers are actually, they're obviously exposed above ground. Although I think it's a very important strategic development that there was a video yesterday I saw that apparently showed a missile being launched from underground, like a silo. So if Iran has these kind of silos now, that is potentially a big development. But regardless, we've been seeing them fire, big salvos of missiles since Saturday. And also there's this argument that's being presented. So these salvos have seemingly decreased. Although last I checked, there were still sirens going off in Israel. People are in shelters. Missiles are seemingly hitting. Israel still has a very severe censorship regime. Hezbollah is also hitting northern Israel. Last I checked, the Ben Gurion airport was still shut down. So these are all, irrespective of the censorship regarding the targets that may or may not be being hit, the mere fact that Israel's economy is shut down, people are in shelters, the airports, have been shut down. That's a huge cost, obviously, for Israel. So Iran, their initial military strategy was to drain a lot of these interceptors and then naturally lower the level of fire but do it over time to keep the costs going, to keep the war going. And so I think, the missile firing rates decreasing by themselves aren't necessarily a sign that, Iran's capability in that regard is neutered. However much the US is trying to, hunt down these launchers. And, Iran's strategy really before this war was a strategy of dispersion across the board, dispersing the political leadership and officials, delegating authority, each official and military official having multiple successors. This was all explicit in Iranian military and strategy discussions that were public. So this is why, when Trump and them say, oh, we didn't know they were going to do this or hit the Gulf countries, that was also publicly threatened and made official by Iran. As well as, the military infrastructure and the launchers are spread out across the country. And now putting aside this ballistic missile and launcher capability, which again, I'm arguing it's going to be hard to destroy. They've geared up to make this a months long campaign and be able to hit, at some level, at least for months and cause, these kind of insecurity for Israel and others. But the other part of this equation for Iran is its drone capability. And its drones have been arguably one of the most successful armaments that Iran has indigenously developed. The Shahed drone, especially that, they export it to Russia and elsewhere. And they have many of these, thousands of these. They can produce them. They're much cheaper as well. And, they can launch these off of like the back of a pickup truck and they can hit targets with accuracy and with destruction with a considerable payload. And unlike the ballistic missile launchers that give off traces that show up on like radar and allow America to hunt them down, these drones don't do that. So the point with the drones is that they will allow Iran kind of in perpetuity to cause a lot of cost in the Persian Gulf region, like because, on these shorter ranges. But that's where Iran's leverage is, that in closing the Strait of Hormuz, threatening oil tankers, threatening the U.S. military bases there, and potentially the energy infrastructure there if this escalates more, that is something that is a leverage point and that Iran will have for a long time, and so.
Quagmire, really striking term. Obviously, people know originally a geographical term. It's like a bog, a marsh. You wade in delusionally and you end up gradually sucked underneath. And people associate that when used in war with Vietnam for the US or Afghanistan for the Soviets. What do you think will make this a quagmire? Because some might go, well, at some point Trump could just get bored, declare victory, and go home, as the phrase goes. So what to you is saying this is a quagmire which they won't be able to extract themselves from in the way they think?
Yeah, so you already see these signs of mission creep. Like they got into this war, by all accounts, under the misimpression that this would be a quick and easy campaign, that they can either get Iran to fold, or I think it was really a regime collapse goal that, they killed Khamenei, the supreme leader of Iran, in the opening blow. The regime would collapse. And I think, Trump is someone who famously does not listen to his intelligence and military briefings. And it seems like a lot of that military intelligence industrial complex, whatever you want to describe it, those forces in the US, they are not necessarily happy about this war. Because the main reason I say that is because of all the leaks. I mean, you had leaks from last week before the war saying the Pentagon is saying this war, they're not ready for this war. They have shortages of munitions. It's not a good idea. There was that report of the chairman of the Joint Chiefs being critical. And then Trump came out with that post saying, no, everyone's on board. He's on board. And then you've just seen regularly a lot of these plans leaking. There was a New York Times story citing kind of, in the intelligence community opposition and how, the various scenarios were very remote, including for uprising in Iran. And most recently, you're seeing these kind of CNN reports and whatnot about they're trying to arm the Kurds, to invade from Western Iran, like kind of potentially separatist groups or, just some of these militias that they're putting together. Or they're trying to, I saw Al Monitor reported this morning that they are trying to arm other ethnic minorities in Iran. So this is where the mission creep really sets in, where, they kind of hit their heads against the wall. They're bashing their heads against the wall right now. The regime is not collapsing. There's no signs of regime cohesion falling apart. Again, they've had this dispersion strategy of their political and military leadership and infrastructure. And by all accounts, Ali Larijani, the chairman of the Supreme National Security Council, and that whole institution, they're all around. President Pezeshkian, the Judiciary Chief AJE, this cleric from the Guardian Council, Adolfi, they're the heads of the new interim leadership council. And they're actively in this trying to select the next supreme leader. The military units are active, they're firing. So, and you see, contrary to an uprising, despite, the big opposition that exists to this government and people who are unhappy with the government and the economic conditions and the political repression in Iran, that, the Islamic Republic does have a base. This is a government that emerged out of a 1979 popular revolution against the Shah. And, I would argue that that base has shrunk over time. But, that base still exists. And with this war, it helps, they've been radicalized immensely. And right now they are the ones in the street. So if you see footage out of Iran right now, Tehran and other cities pretty much across the country, thousands, if not tens of thousands of the supporters of the government. And that doesn't mean that, the government is like all popular and, all Iranians are kind of rallying behind them. But it just means that, Iranian society is polarized. It is, much like many other societies, but even more intensely, I would argue, and fractured. And a war or militarized situation, which, many people have long argued, it doesn't lead to democratic transition. It actually enables these kind of governments and regimes and authoritarian systems to become more repressive, to justify more severe crackdowns, and to rally themselves and consolidate themselves. So a lot of this is kind of playing out in a textbook way, really.
Mm. And again, it's just worth emphasizing, you're someone, you grew up in the US, but you were born in Tehran. You have huge amounts of family who are currently in Iran at the moment. Just want to talk about that point about the regime, because in The Economist, they are quoting Israeli intelligence sources saying there were signs of Iranian soldiers, police officers, and IRGC members failing to show up for duty. So that's what's being pushed by the Israeli intelligence services. What's your take on that? Because, again, if people think about Iraq, Libya, Afghanistan, actually, when those wars began, those regimes had very little support, actually. But at that particular point, they had no real enthusiasm behind them. I know there is, of course, broad opposition within Iranian society, but this is different, isn't there? Because there is a base. So I'm just wondering what you think is going on with that base, and also is there a kind of broader part of Iranian society which is, is disillusioned and upset with the regime, which can be brought into a kind of nationalist fold, I guess, in the face of an attack? Is that what's going on?
I think that's a critical point because I've long argued that, there's a staunch base for the Islamic Republic within the country. There's a staunch opposition. And then there's this middle of Iranian society, which I would argue, and I don't want to get into why, I think it's actually based on empirical evidence and polling and election data and whatever. But, there's something like, maybe 50 to 60% that is the silent majority or the middle of Iranian society, and which way they sway is very critical. And I think in a wartime situation, they more sway in the direction of not wanting, hardline government or, behind the regime per se, but much like we saw in the June War, rallying behind in defense of their country, their homeland, in solidarity with each other, and for the stability of their country, not wanting it to fall apart, not wanting chaos, not, basically the key question is, will Iranians in large numbers, in a critical mass at this juncture, take to the streets to contribute to the US and Israeli campaign? And that, I think, is very unlikely. So that doesn't mean that they support the government. That means they haven't crossed that threshold. And I think what we're more seeing and everything I'm hearing is people are supporting each other. People are evacuating. People are terrified. People are trying to, have enough food, have enough water. And, meanwhile, the government supporters and, including the Basij, their this armed militia are patrolling the streets and in the streets and, heightening that kind of repressive apparatus that further dissuades, protests. So, yeah, I think, but, the Israeli line and on a lot of this Economist report citing this Israeli intelligence claims that Iranian security forces are not showing up at their posts or police or whatever. Well, first, I mean, I think, we all have to take with immense skepticism anything that's according to Israeli intelligence sources, because they have proven time and again to mislead, especially on the Iran issue, which they've been trying to
Well,
agitate for a war for Iran. They've been trying to drag America into a war with Iran for decades. And that includes a lot of, frankly, just deception
yeah,
operations aimed at Americans and aimed at American leaders.
yeah,
And so what we've been seeing happen is that Israel has been targeting police stations all across Tehran and other parts of Iran, including, I just saw yesterday, they targeted a park that was named Police Park. But it wasn't a police station, obviously. It was called, the name was Police Park, and it got
my,
bombed.
oh my
And this
word.
very much suggested that they're relying on these AI systems, much like they did in Gaza, which are obviously extremely prone to error and have resulted in indiscriminate killings of civilians. And even that school they bombed the opening day in Iran, in Minab in southern Iran, that killed, like, hundreds of schoolgirls. That seems to be, it seems like, oh, maybe like 10 years ago, that facility was part of a potential military base. But since then, for many years, it's been a school, for like elementary school. And so,
Well,
like, it's a combination of seemingly whatever database that AI got fed was outdated. So, but if this is what they're relying on, it just shows that, these authoritarian and fascistic figures like Netanyahu and Trump obviously don't care about democracy or liberty in their own countries, and they're not going to be the ones to bring it to Iran. And now, as they're bashing their heads against the wall, they are, I mean, well, first of all, just to circle back to that point about the police, is that, the police stations are being bombed. So obviously they're not going to work.
yeah.
But is there signs of instability, protest, disorder? That I haven't seen any evidence of. So if people have evidence, I'd love to look at it. I have not seen any evidence of that. Again, that's not what the streets are right now in Iran. Um, yeah, I'll leave it at that for now. Go
I
ahead.
mean, on just in terms of I mean, I'm just interested, obviously, because I'm talking to you, you've got your analyst hat on, but you're human. This is your heritage, your family are there. It's a lot to go through. But in terms of what impact do you think that this bombing campaign is taking? What nature is it taking? But I guess I'm interested, I'm sure it's just reported, and I'm not just talking about the diaspora. I'm talking about people in Iran, people who would have thought, "I hate this regime and I just want to get rid of it. They've committed terrible atrocities. This isn't perfect, but this might be the only way to get rid of them." And do you think the nature of the bombing campaign is having an impact on maybe people who might have seen the US and Israel as some sort of imperfect rescuer, and that's making them shift their view?
Yeah, I think absolutely. I mean, I see that happening in real time. Since last week, since those initial days when many people were justifiably, happy that Khamenei was assassinated. And, I think many Iranians were under the impression that a military campaign can improve their lives immediately and at low cost. Because when you really look at the kind of media campaigns that target Iranians in Persian, like Iran International, this multi-$100 million media enterprise that we know was funded by the Saudis. Now it seems like it's funded by the Israelis and other
Well,
kind of Persian language media. If you look at their programming, it's 24/7, like, giving people this impression that, these people, Israel and America, want what's best for you. They're going to come and liberate you, and it's going to be low cost. It's going to be easy. So many people were under this impression that, oh my, this is going to be easy, and it's kind of a delusion that a lot of propaganda apparatus is promoted to exploit people's legitimate grievances and legitimate anger and wanting change. And so, yeah, I've seen in real time that, as this footage comes out of mounting civilian casualties, infrastructure hitting, but perhaps the most consequential is now these reports that they want to arm these ethnic groups in Iran to destabilize the country. So this is something that's going to unite Iranians from the base of the Islamic Republic to the monarchist opposition and Reza
what I
Pahlavi's.
was going to ask you about this. So because you talked about not just the arming of these Kurdish militia, but also potentially militia from other ethnic groups. Iran is an extremely diverse nation. Again, that marks out from these three, I guess, totemic catastrophes of the 21st century. They're all diverse. I was in Baghdad a few, months ago, and obviously there was a sectarian bloodbath in Iraq, but Iran is so much bigger than any of those countries were. It's 93 million people, vast, diverse nation. I'm interested because I saw, Reza Pahlavi was on Twitter denouncing separatists in an aggressive way, and obviously he's the exiled crown prince, the figurehead of the monarchist section. But the point he was talking about that is something which unites. He's the pro-US, pro-Israel guy that I guess his father was very repressive towards minorities in Iran. But what do you think about that in terms of how Iranians see it? That kind of strategy, and do you actually think it is part of a strategy, not least pushed by Israel, to balkanize, to fragment Iran, that actually army, and that's how Iranians will see it? What do you think?
Yeah, well, within the realm of Iranian opposition politics, the 2022 Women Life Freedom movement was a key inflection point. And that was a woman-led movement. And it was actually started, it was a Kurdish woman, a Kurdish Iranian woman, Mahsa Amini, who was detained by the morality police and died in their custody. And the protests began in Iranian Kurdistan. And, many of these ethnic minorities have faced marginalization and discrimination, both from the Islamic Republic and the two Pahlavi states that preceded it, both the Shah in 1979, who was toppled, and his father, Reza Shah. And they have legitimate grievances, from the Baluch to the Arab Iranians to the Kurdish Iranians. But interesting, what happened was a 2022 Women Life Freedom movement, which was a much more progressive movement,
No.
protest movement in Iran that was really inclusive of many different actors and groups. What happened was, since then, the monarchist movement has become much more virulent and much more aggressive and much more in a very hegemonic, exclusionary way, trying to take over the entire Iranian opposition. And so anyone who's been following Iranian opposition politics for these past couple of years know how much the monarchist and Reza Pahlavi and his supporters and his advisors have been so anti-Kurd, so anti-Baluch, so anti-Arab, and anti anyone who's them, but especially on these ethnic minorities. And to the point that so preceding this war, which now in retrospect, we can see they were probably laying the grounds for this, like Israel and America were, there's two things that happened. There was a coalition formed amongst certain Baluchi groups in southwestern Iran, and then a coalition that formed last week amongst some Kurdish groups. And so Reza Pahlavi actually has a tweet, where he's explicitly, I'm going to go find this and actually tweet it out, where he's explicitly said he called that he would repress these Kurds.
He
So
said
putting
they
aside
were,
the Islamic Republic now
yeah,
repressing these, but point is that obviously
yeah.
the Kurds are being used here. If they use the Baluch or whatever, they're going to be used and exploited. And I think even amongst these populations, they don't want this to happen, and they're going to have so much difficulty. So yeah, to my point about the U.S. and Israel banging their heads against the wall, this is a desperation solution because they must know that this is going to turn so many more Iranians against them. They might be able to get a tiny bit of Western Iran and try to hold on to that for a little bit, but it's a really, really dumb strategy. It's definitely going to backfire on Iranian public opinion. Because, there's a sad element to that, because I would just personally say that, these ethnic minorities in Iran deserve so much more, and Iranians should support that. But there is such a fear of separatism in Iran, like whether well placed or not. I mean, right now it's well placed with US and Israel, but historically. And so there's so many Iranians who are just kind of so immensely hostile to like activism or mobilization, certainly military mobilization by these groups in these regions. So I think what's going to happen, that if they push the Kurds into Iraq, into Iran, which I've heard from very credible sources or in contact with the situation, that the Kurds don't want this. Neither the Iraqi Kurds and the Kurdistan regional governments and the Barzanis and the Talibanis and the ruling kind of elites there. And even these Iranian groups don't. But basically, the Trump administration is trying to force them into this doom, And even the Washington Post had a report to this morning to this end, that it's like you're either with the U.S. or with Iran. So he's trying to force them to fight, have some kind of ground incursion. So it's going to go really bad. That's going to go really bad. And what's going to happen is, because in Iraq, Iran also has many allies, the popular mobilization units, the PMU, the militias, the armed groups. And then Turkey as well is, for its own pretty awful reasons, has been very anti-Kurdish autonomy, Kurdish kind of self-determination movements. And so they're going to try to crush that as well. And I think because the Turks probably also see in it Israeli designs to destabilize the entire region. Because, if there's if the fires of separatism and instability are stoked in Iran, that could easily spread to Turkey. and draw in Turkey, which would be great for Israel. If the Baluchis, there's unrest there, that can easily spread to Pakistan. Or if Iran and the GCC states go to total war, then, for Israel, it's just great. Israel's this tiny, ethno-supremacist state that is expansionist and very aggressive, and it wants to rule over this region. So it would love if all these other rivals and potential rivals and would-be rivals, or just potential counterbalances, are degraded, fragmented, collapsed along ethnic lines and made into small states just like it. So that is really, I think, their
Mm,
grand strategy, or what they would be perfectly happy with, which is totally bad for American interests, which is, I would continue to strongly distinguish between American interests and this interest of this,
mhm.
what should be a protectorate or client state of America that acts like it's the great power in the relationship.
Yeah.
Yeah,
But is it because, I mean, we hear growing numbers of Israeli figures talking about Turkey as the next main strategic threat. So that is a very important spectre there. Just
yeah.
let's just
Naftali Bennett said that last week. Yeah,
exactly, yeah, the former prime minister. Just it's how the hell do we get here? And I think it's worth just asking that because if you look back to the Iraq War, there was a huge propaganda build-up, actually. It went on for a long time, and I remember I'm a geriatric millennial, I remember it well. I remember going to the first protest in September 2002, and it obviously was March 2003 it happened. And they did the whole performance of the United Nations, Colin Powell, famous load of bullshit that he he spread. No, but I mean, they did the whole full shebang. You didn't get that here. It's odd, I would say. What the hell has happened? Why is basic question, often the most profound, why the hell is the US at war with Iran?
so it's very interesting because, this is a group of idiots. I mean, sorry to be frank, but I mean, the Trump administration and them, I mean, the Bush administration, primed the American public for war for Iraq for, like you said, at least a year. Like, I remember that era well as well, too. And, they actually went to the UN. They bothered to go to the UN. They bothered to convince the American people. And they connected it, based on lies to 9/11, WMDs, all this stuff. But, there was a period of manufacturing consent and indoctrination. And obviously Iran is a country that's been demonized for many decades in American public opinion, but no one was primed for a big war with Iran. And so whereas George W. Bush entered the Iraq war in March 2003 with something like 80 to 90% public approval for it, Trump is entering this war with, like, I think it's like 60 to 70% disapproval and opposition, including in the MAGA base. So it's totally ill thought out, which, again, that's why I say they're idiots. I mean, it's crazy. I mean, it's like not listening to his own, military intelligence advisors. I think he's had pro-Israel donors and Israel and Netanyahu in his ear. And I think he was really riding high off of his tactical military successes, which weren't strategic successes. And those stories are far from over. Like in Venezuela, okay, they took Maduro. Rodriguez is there. The whole Venezuelan regime is there. We'll see where that goes. Maybe they're just waiting out Trump. It's not. And then, but he thinks of that as he was able to sell it. I think for Trump, what matters is not the reality of the situation. It's like, can I do some military action that I can have a big political spectacle and bombast over, and I can frame it as a victory, and people are going to believe it as a victory, at least enough people. So with Venezuela, he got that. With the Iran war last summer, he got that. With this, he's not, this was clearly not going to go that way. And so he's stuck. He's stuck, and it's very scary because it's like, where is he going to go from here? He's already escalated from opening day. Iranian people, you're free, take to the streets. People didn't. And then he went from, like, this could end soon. They want to negotiate. I want to talk to them, to they don't want to, I don't want to talk, to, this is because Iran was going to have bombs next week or something. He said that yesterday, which is an even worse lie
Mm.
than the WMD lie. Because this is like, even he claims he obliterated the nuclear program last summer. It's totally absurd. Like, they're like headless chickens running around. And now they're trying to arm these ethnic minorities in Iran, which is going to have all these other blowback and ramifications, and it's kind of a doomed effort. Meanwhile, the Strait of Hormuz is closed. The price of energy is going up. We've already seen these big stock markets kind of twists and turns and overall declines, especially the Asian markets. The price of gas in Europe is going really high. I've seen some outlets report that, I guess, some European states are considering starting energy gas exports from Russia again to them, which again, I mean, it's so contrary to their actual security interests. Where if Russia is the main strategic threat, it's not Iran. Despite the obsession with Iran, so it's very ill thought out, and it's like the chickens are coming home to roost from a lot of poor Iran policy and thinking about Iran in Washington and the narratives pushed by Israel and its supporters.
Just finally, I'm interested what I don't know, if you got any general sense of where things go for now, not least where things go from now, not least in Iran, how you can see this playing out in the coming weeks. I'm also just interested what your take on kind of US power is, what this says about the nature of the US power. Look, cards on the table. I've written a book called The Fall of the West, so I have a thesis. And I think this is both a symptom and an accelerant of decline. This is what a declining power which is responding to its decline by thinking it can, substitute what it's lost with brute force, lashing out in various ways, which is not actually going to help it at all, as more planned disasters didn't help it, but accelerated its decline, like neighboring Iraq. That was a long spiel. But what's your take? Where do you see things going for the country of your birth and where your family live? What do you think you see this coming? And what's your general broader take on what this means for the hegemon, such as it is?
Yeah, I think, for when the history is written on the American empire, let's say decades from now, 100 years from now, hundreds of years from now, that period of sharp decline is ultimately, I think, going to prove out to have been in the Middle East for its misadventures in the Middle East. Especially after the end of the Cold War, America had this period of Pax Americana and unchallenged dominance, and they just fumbled it immensely out of hubris and out of a lot of the things that have led to the decline and end of great powers throughout history and have always actually led to like empires always decline and end. Great powers always decline and end inevitably. And one of the big causes of that is when their perceived commitments and security commitments and interests outweigh their ability to meet them. And so right now we see that, what undergirds American global hegemony in large part is its alliance network and the credibility that it'll have to these allies, as well as, things like the petrodollar and this key region of the Persian Gulf. And this is now up in flames, and America's unable to protect these countries. A, it got them into a war they didn't want. B, and C, it's, going forward, the economies of these countries are a total question mark. The political economies of Dubai and Saudi Arabia, they revolve around foreign investment. Foreign investment needs stability. Right now people are paying $250,000 to get out of Dubai. Like that's happened. The airport was hit, the ports are hit, Burj Al Khalifa was hit. And that's, Iran is increasing that cost for them. And this is and so will that image of Dubai return? Can it, especially if the goal is to push Iran into instability and perpetuity? Iran, again, is right across the Persian Gulf. The drones are always going to be able to hit Dubai, especially if they're trying to destroy the country and arming these militias. And there's going to be so many radical groups in Iran too, in that kind of scenario. So, it's really this global hegemon shooting itself in the foot. Now, obviously, I think, empires don't decline or end generally because of foreign wars, like
Yeah.
individually. It's not like a foreign power comes and defeats an empire. It's because of internal issues and decline and, this imperial overstretch and the commitments outweighing their ability to meet them. And you see a lot of that obviously with the US today, and Trump is an accelerant of that, and a war of Iran would be an accelerant to that. And I think, to that point going forward, things to watch out for is how, Trump might very well decide to wash his hands of this, which, he can twist reality and he's like, oh, I sunk your navy. Great victory. I'm done. Even though Iran didn't ever have a navy, it was never considered a naval power, whatever. And, I mean, at that point, it's like Iran has an incentive to keep this war going on until it gets a favorable diplomatic settlement. So if Trump basically has some humiliating backtracking in which he gives Iran some kind of the deal that was on the table last week, let's say, which
Yeah.
was a good deal, stronger
Mhm.
than Obama's nuclear deal, gives Iran sanctions relief and whatever. Yeah. And then he could wash his hands of this, which in that scenario or the scenario of this war, mission creep gives into U.S. ground troops, gives into total quagmire. as they're threatening months long, years long. Trump even said it could be a forever war. That would obviously be, another Vietnam, another Iraq, I would argue. And so, however you look at this, I think it's a huge strategic catastrophe for America, and it'll be remembered like that, and probably as another big inflection point on the scale of Iraq, if not worse.
What a place to end a truly shocking and chilling kind of prospect to even consider. But, I guess the point is this is a much bigger country, far more complicated in lots of ways, a regime with a much bigger base of support, less strategy, and a more disastrous administration, and an already weakened US power. We could go on. I mean, it's every possible ingredient for a disastrous result. Anyway, what an amazing analysis as ever. For everyone watching, please like and subscribe. Leave your thoughts, leave your comments, always read through those. But Sina, honestly, it's such a pleasure to speak to you. And also solidarity right now. This is a lot. And I hope your family are doing as okay as is possible.
Appreciate
So all
that,
my
man.
thoughts.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Always.
Take care.